Okay, study Danico iktima machka. Xknat Tims Boat noch just a go. I need to be gunnikwa. Indigenous science is based on relationships with all of creation, water included. Okay, sweet peaks, mamiks, all those water beings. And then we got the trees, we got the four-legged, we got the winged ones, and we got the clouds and the rain and the cycle that has delivered life the way it is that we know it today. If anyone goes to look at the Oldman River Dam Reservoir, there's no water. Now they're talking about, the province is talking about water. The thing about people today is no one talks about a river until it's gone dry or about to go dry.
Just miles of this. 3 rivers flowing in, and each one has got miles of this silt built up.
Not everyone wants to talk about climate change, but we all need water. Even without a changing climate, drought is real. Scientists have found historical evidence of severe droughts lasting 10 years or more. People alive today lived through the dirty 30s.
In parts of Southern Alberta, there have been consecutive years of drought. If we look into the near future, it doesn't look good because we're in a phase of El Nino. And El Nino is nearly always associated with dry conditions, especially in winter, which is exactly what we have on the prairies. For December, we have remarkably high temperatures and virtually no snow. So that relationship between El Nino and the climate is holding for the time being. And as long as we have a El Nino or another El Nino reoccurs a few years from now, we could be in a position of sustained drought. In fact, that's the explanation we have for these prolonged droughts in the tree record, that it was a situation of multiple El Nino events occurring within a decade or two. There's also another scale of what we call oscillation. El Nino is an oscillation. It's an oscillation of ocean temperature. And it really drives our climate on a year-by-year basis. But there's another oscillation of the Pacific Ocean that's a slower circulation that produces this decadal variation in our climate, where we can get a decade or two that's relatively dry and a decade or two that's relatively wet. Well, if you embed El Nino within a dry phase of the decadal oscillation, then you've got a perfect storm, you've got the worst case scenario. That's how we account for these prolonged droughts in the tree rings, that it was a situation where El Nino was occurring repeatedly in a dry phase of the decadal oscillation, and that's reoccurring now. We're pretty certain that the tree rings give us an accurate picture of how the climate and the water has varied over the last 1,000 years. Also, we have another means of verifying the tree ring record is other types of information. And for example, our tree rings show that there was a series of droughts in the 1700s. Well, there have been geological studies to show that sand dunes on the prairies that today are stable and covered with grass were moving back then. Probably the best example would be the mid-1800s, when, according to the tree readings, there was a couple decades of mostly dry years. Well, that's when Captain John Palliser and his crew came through and declared the Canadian prairies forever comparatively useless. They came through during a long drought. We also have the oral history of Indigenous people. We've had knowledge keepers and elders tell us stories about times when, for example, in a lake there were islands that had appeared because the water had dropped by so much. Or there were times when the animals were ill because the water was stagnant. The water levels were poor. So we've collected information from various sources to corroborate or verify what the tree rings are telling us. This is probably some of the more significant information that we can provide people that say, okay, if you're enjoying a wet decade, don't get too complacent, because it's only part of a natural cycle, and it will be followed by a dry decade or two. That you should be prepared for those drier conditions. We have some tremendous locations on the eastern slopes of the Rockies. For example, in the Porcupine Hills on the ranch of the Mowat family, there are some dry, steep slopes facing south and west where the Douglas fir is spaced far apart, and they're hundreds and hundreds of years old.
I found this graph really interesting when David Sachin brought it to us, and the work he did here was over a few years where they'd been taking the samples out of the trees for the rings, and it really went along with what I remember from being here on the ranch. And my family's been here for over 100 years now. These old Douglas fir trees really tell the history of what has happened here going back. This graph goes back to 1377. It looks really accurate, from what I can see. In 95, he's got a real big spike here. And of course, we know there was a huge flood in 95. We had over, 20 some inches of rain that spring. And the thing is that this graph shows there's a lot wetter cycles and a lot drier cycles than anybody can remember in the last 100 years. In 1377 is when the graph starts. And of course, we can all experience this spike here in 95. This was when we had the flood. And our family experienced this dryness in 1984. And we had no crops here for 2 years then. And this graph is right on with that. And then to go back further, here's a really, really wet, 95 was wet, but here in 1837, this graph goes right through the roof here. On the dry side, 1555, there was a dry spell that was just as big or definitely longer. Looks like it lasted 12 years, that dry spell. And so that was what really stands out, is we've had dry spells going back way longer than we've ever experienced. Water's everything. Everybody needs water, and it's very universal as far as we just,
There's so much concern about climate change, but we also need to be adapted or prepared for just the natural variability. And that natural variability will not go away. Our future climate is a combination of global climate change and just the natural variability of our climate. And the tree rings capture that natural variability. And what the tree rings have told us more than anything else is it's possible to have entire decades when most of the years are dry. That sort of happened in the 20th century with the 1930s and even the 1980s. But there are droughts in the tree ring record that are much more severe and much more prolonged. And those droughts of greater severity and more longer duration will reoccur in the future. But they will occur in a climate that's warmer than in the past. So the current drought is definitely severe, and we have extremely dry conditions. But the tree rings tell us that that kind of drought can persist for multiple years. It can be a sustained drought or years of back-to-back drought. And that's the worst case scenario.
When drought happens, our complacency ends and we scramble for solutions. The Oldman Dam is meant to store spring runoff and release it gradually in summer when it's needed for irrigation. Dams don't cure droughts because dams can't store water that isn't there.
Dams, reservoirs, canals, irrigation, this is the solution to living in a dry climate. Because if it can store water, it'll be available in dry years. But that assumes the water is available to store. It doesn't matter how much infrastructure you have, the water has to be replenished if those dams are to be effective in sustaining the communities and the agriculture. Similarly, irrigation is fantastic and it's practiced throughout the world to produce crops in dry climates, but it assumes water will be available. At some point, if a drought is of sufficient duration, then irrigation water is no longer available. The climate varies from year to year. It's really a situation where you get multiple dry years within a decade or two. Not every year, but multiple dry years, so that the ecosystem and the watershed aren't able to recover. Even if you have a relatively wet year, if it's bookended by a bunch of dry years, the watershed doesn't have much opportunity to recover.
Future years, like if we don't get a good snowpack this year or have similar conditions, downstream users will likely be in similar positions to the positions that we are in as upstream users this year. And there is potential that we're already seeing the effects of some of that because we have seen a rise in our annual mean temperature already. I think I would say that it's very important for people to be aware that water, like energy, like other resources, is limited, and especially in our case in Southern Alberta here. And taking measures just like you would to save costs on energy to lower your water usage is important, and that's not just for municipal users, that's irrigators, that's ranchers. It's going to continue to be a point of discussion over the coming decades as our populations continue to grow in Southern Alberta and maybe Southern Saskatchewan too. And I just hope that people take it seriously and that governments take it seriously as well, and that users downstream of us take it seriously as well, because I think we are most likely to see the immediate effects due to our high exposure to relying essentially on the runoff, and the downstream users don't necessarily see that as much because of all the control systems in between them, control systems being reservoirs basically, but that has the potential to change in the future if water levels continue to deplete. So
this is really dry. It's probably not quite as dry as it was in the 80s. In the early 80s, it was drier than this. Right? So, but then we had a period of really wet years, and everybody got kind of complacent, I guess, for lack of a better word, that we had lots of water. Right? So, but water is a finite resource. And I think we're starting to realize that. We actually, as a municipality, declared a local agricultural kind of state of emergency this summer. And it wasn't so much about crop yields, it was more about worried about water. Because the people that are using, summer pastures and have water source those summer pastures, bring those cattle out in the fall. And they need a water source at home. And that source wasn't there.
We rent our land out for cattle grazing, And then we have hay, and we sell the hay. We keep some for us for the horses, and then we sell the rest. So that's what we did. But this year was really bad. And so much so we debated even putting cows out here because it was so dry, the ground was so dry, that the cattle would sort of destroy everything because it was too dry.
Well, we've put in a water system with solar powered pump and tanks and so on to get water off to our various fields. And if we hadn't had a dam and a solar pump this year, we couldn't have grazed. There was not enough flow in the stream unaided to have taken care of the cows. It's not good. And a coal mine would damage quality and quantity of water flow. They take water in a continuous amount, and the mountains deliver it in varying amounts. So if they're pulling their regular amounts when the mountains are not releasing very much, everybody downstream's in trouble. And downstream goes all the way to Churchill.
And people, we're not looking down the road 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years of what's going to happen if we don't have water and the population keeps growing. Like Al suggested, what would happen if we shut the water off to Lethbridge for a day? What would they do? Let them see what's going to be like when they don't have any water, or they're very limited to water. As it is now, they have to start hauling water to Cowley and Limerick because the intakes are way above the water. There's no water. So what's going to happen to Lethbridge and those downstream that have to start hauling water to bigger areas? That's a lot of money. So, everybody keeps thinking that there's this endless resource. We're never going to run out. And we are going to run out. We're seeing it right now. Our snowfalls are a lot less than when I was growing up. We used to have way more snow when I was growing up. The snowfalls are getting less and less every winter. I can see this. So, I don't know. It gets really frightening. And I just sort of think sometimes, thank God I live out here.
When you've got yourself in a hole, the first thing you do is stop digging. And that basically amounts to around here and downstream. Take a look at what water we've got. Make sure we're using it carefully. There's talk about opening up a big new irrigation area down in southeastern Alberta in the ballpark of 100,000 acres. And Saskatchewan's making similar noises.
Where's water going to come from?
Particularly if you look at the mountains and you look at an old picture, there's a lot less snow and ice up there. We're mining the water from centuries ago, and eventually the ore runs out. And the climate projections say we're going to get a lot less precipitation, and particularly we're going to get it in forms that make it hard to use. We have to stop being foolish with how we use it. We've got to stop being foolish with what we do with the places the water comes from. The forestry guys will tell you that if they go and clear cut it, you'll get more water. Yeah, but we won't get it in the form we can use it. We'll get a giant rush in the spring. We'll get nothing in August and September. And nobody in this country lives and prospers on water flows that are that cyclical. you can't rape and pillage the watershed and have anybody downstream flourish. And if we don't look at it in a decades format, the grandchildren I don't have won't have a happy life. But the grandchildren that everybody around here seems to have will pay a price for our being stupid.
This year, the river ran mud all summer, and it never ran clear. The other thing I saw was fish chopped up and dead floating down. Mostly suckers and whitefish, but there's a few trout in there and lots of baby lingcod. Yeah, right here we used to ice fish a few years ago in 15 feet of water, for trout and lingcod. And now we're draining the reservoir so much, there's no fishing at all. Every time I come here, it looks different. There was vertical banks a while ago. They've been falling in, getting pushed further and further into the reservoir by the flow of this thick mud. So this reservoir is a wintering spot for the Crow's Nest, Castle, and Oldman rivers. This is where the trout, the bull trout, the cutthroat, the browns, rainbows, a lot of them fall back in here to spend the winter in the depths. But there's no more depths. This has turned into a very unproductive reservoir with all the silt. The bottom is just mud. There's not a lot of life in here producing insects and food for trout anymore. So imagine this. You're a trout heading out of the mountains to your overwintering spot. You come out of the relatively clear Oldman up there about a mile and a half away. And to get into hopefully some cleaner water, you've got to swim a couple of miles through this thick, silty mud. There's a good chance fish enters that, he's going to die. That water is so thick, he's going to die before he gets to where he wants to overwinter. So this reservoir is potentially the death of 3 rivers as far as trout goes. All these rivers hold native cutthroat, native bull trout. They're threatened, endangered species. No idea what the plan is. What I see in the upper stretches of the Oldman is normally, like I said, we learned the habits and pulses of the river. Normally, opening day, June 16th, most anglers would not bother going out because they know it's going to be high and starting to recede after spring floods, right, with not a hope in crossing it. And this year, opening day, you could cross the Oldman River up in the forestry area all over the place. And it just got worse, obviously. And even though we did get rain this summer, not enough rain to actually bump up the levels. It didn't seem, it rained, but it didn't seem to affect the level of the river hardly at all. And the same on the Crow's Nest and Castle. Like, we got rain this summer for a change. It's kind of like back to the good old days where you get thunderstorms in July at 4 o'clock. But didn't really see the rivers hardly go up at all. I think Mother Earth was just dry. And then when you get into the logged out areas, that rain, where the clear-cut logging goes on, part of the process is bulldozing the mountainside, so water just disperses. It doesn't collect anymore and enter the streams or the aquifers. It just dissipates. As soon as you step off that river, and then step into that clear cut, the air temperature goes up like 10, 15 degrees instantly. And my theory is that as an outdoorsman is, if you want to get warm in the winter, you go into the trees. If you want to get cool in the summer, you go into the trees. Like, global warming is not just about gas and oil. It's about clear cutting and all these hot spots that are created by it. It's heating up the valley, and we need cool water for our native cutthroat and bull trout. That's the only reason they're here. Logging has had all these effects that I've seen over the years, and there was a lot of logging anticipating coal mining, and that has really made a major impact all over the province to a lot of people just in the last 5 years. I think if one coal mine goes through in the Oldman watershed system, with the known selenium issues, that will definitely be, the final straw for our fisheries. And in Southern Alberta, we have a 10-mile wide strip of mountains and trees that act as a sponge to hold our water. And the clear-cut logging practices, which are legal right now, they need to change. There's the effect on the amount of water held by the forest and released by the forest to our downstream users in agriculture, in industry, in towns is obvious by looking at the reservoir here. Alberta's in big trouble. The reservoir is so full of silt that the capacity is diminished to a point where towns are trucking water. I'm very surprised we don't hear a lot from the downstream users, the irrigators and the towns and the industries. I think they have to come up here and take a look. That's so sad.
And said the reason why we got to be quiet, because lots of spirits live here in the mountains. And if we disturb those spirits, they will get mad and they will leave the mountains. Then the mountains will become sick. And when the mountains become sick, all the land will become sick. And the animals, and the plants, and the people will cry out to the Creator. But it'll be too late. Today, that story is as clear as could be. That's what she was talking about. That's what traditional Blackfoot wisdom and knowledge and respect is based on. Today in the mountains, it's a free-for-all.
We can't control weather cycles. We're having trouble finding consensus about dealing with climate change. But one thing we can do, we can start making better land use decisions in our headwaters. That's the only real way to increase water security. Drought reminds us why we should have started sooner.